Friends and enemies, welcome back. Canadian Bitcoiners podcast, the mighty CBP. I'm Joey, being joined today, not by Len, by the invincible, untouchable Mike Campbell. That's a reference to an old Capo and Noriega rap song for you guys who are a little younger than me. We have a lot to talk about. Mike's been a friend of the show for a long time. I've appeared on his program many times. And, Canada's in a weird place right now. And so we try and get Mike on once a year, twice a year to talk about where things are here in the country economically. We'll discuss how Mike has, I think it's safe to say, started to approach Canada's problems through a new lens, through a new set of viewpoints as they relate to social cohesion, which we will talk about. And if there's one thing you can count on Mike for, it's a no punches pulled conversation. And why should he pull punches? He's, one of Canada's most well-recognized names in business and obviously host of the Money Talks show, which we talk about on our show all the time. So we'll get to that. First, though, the sponsors, EasyDNS, best place for you to host your content. Why? Well, first of all, there's a money back guarantee, which I only found out about like a month ago. Not that I needed it, but if you need it for some reason, you find, Mark is not providing you a service that's to your satisfaction. First of all, take a look in the mirror. Okay. It's probably your fault, but just in case, after that self-reflection, you still think you want to back out, you can do that. No problem. No receipts, no nothing needed. Your content is safe. Mark actually told us yesterday, he pulled someone down from EasyDNS for the first time in as long as he can remember, a rather racist subgroup, we'll say. So there are some lines, like if there's ever a line in the sand, maybe that's the one. But generally speaking, if you're just talking about Bitcoin and other stuff that is a thorn in the side of the regime, Mark is not going to take you down. You don't have any fear there. And then, of course, for the Bitcoin enthusiast, VPS, virtual private server stuff, which includes stuff like Nostr relays, Nostr relays, Bitcoin nodes, among other things. You want to run a BTC Pay server, start a little shop, sell pictures of your feet, whatever, man. Do whatever you want in your free time, but do it with Mark and EasyDNS. Load up your cart, 50% off your first round of buys. You can't beat it. We're super pumped that Mark is a continuing partner of the show. Second sponsor, Bull Bitcoin. Bitcoin is up right now, I think. Let me see. 67,000. I don't know. Up from earlier, I guess. And that's all that matters at Bull. You can buy, sell, use, live on the Bitcoin standard. All non-custodial. Great. Don't have to worry about any rug pulls there. You can buy with your debit card via e-transfer. You can buy with a wire transfer. You can sell your house and move into Bitcoin. Let's move your assets into Bitcoin, not move your ass into Bitcoin. But, maybe we'll get there someday. Who knows what the software protocol will allow for in the future. And then on top of that, like I said, if you want to pay some bills in Bitcoin and live on the Bitcoin standard, all doable with the Bills platform. These guys have you covered no matter if it's a cell phone bill or you're paying for your underwater basket weaving degree at a local Canadian university that's way overstaffed and way underperforming. It's all available to you via Bull Bitcoin and the Bills platform. Go there, use our promo code. You start buying, I think you fund your account and give them the necessary info. You get like $20 still, which is dope. But the big thing is that it's not custodial. The team is amazing. You guys know Francis and the guys very well by now. And again, thrilled to be a partner with them. Third sponsor, Decentral Technologies. This is why, by the way, me and Len split the ad reads because I already need a glass of milk here. But Decentral Tech is the place to go, whether you want to start a garage mining operation, a basement mining operation, or a wife-friendly mining operation. Whatever your needs are. You need a new board? They got you. You want to heat your house? They got you. You want to put a case around something that you're using already? They got you. You want to do some offshoot project that you need some advice on? They got you. You want to get a bid axe, a CBP branded bid axe, maybe start your lottery mining or join a pool. I don't know, but whatever it is you want to do, they got you. And the most important thing, of course, guys, there's no promo code. So we just want to support them. They want to support the show. It's a beautiful thing, hard to find partners like the ones we have. And we're happy to add Decentral Technologies to the group. So go there, buy some stuff and tell them we sent you. The one, the only, Mike Campbell. What's going on, man? How the heck are you? Is it like a good place to start? I think you've had quite a few weeks here. Things are going well, though, it seems. You're looking well, looking handsome as ever. How are you?
I'm laughing at the concept of looking well. You get on in the years, Joey, and you go look in the mirror and you go, what happened? What the heck? So we can leave that one alone. Yeah, I have had a bit of a problem. I had a bacterial infection, a fall, 2 operations, etc. And feeling much better from that.
Outstanding. I'm glad to hear that. We'll talk a bit about this sort of state of the healthcare system. I'm going through it right now for a different reason that I'll share with you and the listeners. The listeners already know because they come to the show, but I don't usually make notes for guests, and I certainly don't make them for guests that we've had a bunch of times. And, you and I know each other fairly well at this point. And, I found myself today thinking about, where am I going to start this conversation? And it started with the text I chose for the thumbnail. Is Canada on the brink? I look around, Mike, and what do I see? I see more and more tense. I see frustrated major city police forces tweeting their frustrations at the PMO. I see healthcare in a state of, seems like perpetual collapse and crumble at this point. I see housing as an issue. I see elections around the corner here and next door. I see social cohesion problems. I think maybe we should start there. I don't want to speak for you, but I said to you the last time I was on your show after we were off the air that it really felt to me like you had taken the gloves off on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And in recent weeks and recent months, one of those things has been the lack of cohesion on display, clear for anyone to see, this fault line between what looks to me to be recent arrivals to Canada. You can define recent however you like, and different religious groups. The Jews are targeted these days, it seems like, with chants in the street almost every day I see on Twitter. The Canadian way of life is under attack in a lot of ways. And I don't say those things lightly, and it's not fun to talk about them, but I want to know a couple of things from you. Why start on a show that's about business, economics, more broadly, talking about this? This is obviously very important to you. Why make that decision? And, give me some of your thoughts. How do you think we got here, man?
Well, let's talk about the foundation of what Canadian life is. I think we had an agreement, a social agreement across the country, and we could have variations of what a Canadian value was, but it was tolerance. I think it was accepting. And look at the switch we've seen in the support for immigration. And I would encourage people to instead think about the failure of vetting the immigrants coming in. I've been very blunt about it. We didn't have this level of hate that, as you just reported, we've been seeing almost on a daily basis, massive protests. If you had told, I think most of us, over a year ago, say, let's make it 13 months ago, so shortly before October 7th to 23,
Mm-hmm.
if you had said, guess what, we're going to take to the streets, we're going to identify a specific ethnic minority, religious minority, and call for their death, I honestly believe we wouldn't have believed it. Whether you substitute Jewish people, Black people, Indigenous people, any minority that we have in this country, I don't think people would have believed it. And the reason is we've imported this. And it's not about all immigrants. It's about the failure of the federal government to vet the immigrants. Is it too much to say that you would agree with Canadian values? Is it too much to ask for, we have an existing society built by Canadians right now, some a lot older than others, are generational. I think, we deserve to have our lifestyle maintained in that value sense. And it clearly hasn't. I mean, that big talk, Joey, that Canada's broken. I don't know how you'd get a more clear example that Canada's broken than when we consistently break hate crime laws. And we have. These are hate crime. You can't identify a single group and wish them ill the way they have with the Jewish Canadians. How can anyone who's Jewish in this country feel safe? And people should think about that. Their crime, they're Jewish. My goodness gracious. As I say, I think it's overwhelming and beyond the imagination of most Canadians. That's why we said for months, oh, this isn't Canada. Well, when is your first hint it is Canada?
It's a good point. I do sometimes think about and for me, the olden days are not as long as the olden days are for you, but I think there's a lot of similarities between the two, right? The thread is basically the same, and you did a good job pinning it down there. This idea that we're accepting, we're trusting. It's a society that you can send your kids to school without worrying that anything's going to happen, and not expect to be persecuted for your religion, your race, your creed, all these things.
Exactly.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about why it's not being met with reprisal by government agencies, by even seems like local police departments in some cases, but yes. I don't want to speak for all of them. Why is that?
Well, first of all, they haven't had the leadership. I think it was very easy. You look at the response they had in Germany. You look at the response even from President Biden, even and the Republicans agreed. No, this is against the law. This, I think that's the simplest one. They could have hidden behind that easily and said, no, we don't have hate crime here. Well, we clearly haven't enforced it. I mean, clearly we haven't enforced it. In fact, it's very rare circumstances where we said that breaks Canada's hate crime laws. It's funny. I was in the hospital the other day and they have one of those signs, and I think we've all seen them, don't be rude, don't be this, don't be that. And I thought, we're not enforcing it in society in general. I mean, we completely eroded the credibility of government in this regard. We have seen blatant, in this case, anti-Semitism, but we wouldn't have allowed it for any other ethnic group and done virtually nothing about it. I asked right from basically October 8th on of last year, where do you think this leads? You can't just sit back and say, oh, it's not my thing. Well, I think we've seen where it leads. Increased violence. Come on. They have shot up Jewish daycare centers, Jewish hospital, obviously vandalizing Jewish businesses. I mean, seriously, at what point do we say enough already? What does the public say? Our leaders have failed us. And so I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. But my thing, one of the most important things a government does is protect its citizens, is let them pursue, whatever freedoms they want, et cetera. And I know that's another debate these days, but, this is way over the bounds of that. How can a Jewish Canadian, if they're a student on campus, if they're, as I say, your child's at that daycare center that got shot? Are you kidding?
Yeah.
The list is a long one. And the response from the government and our leaders has been so timid. It's been playing both sides. Now, again, getting in the reasons for that, keep in mind, I'm just trying to think of who just called the NDP the party of anti-Semitism. But they're sure right. If you look out in British Columbia, again, maybe many of your listeners aren't familiar with the story, but longtime NDP cabinet minister, Selina Robertson, was ousted. Why? Because she was targeted by the Palestinian Youth Movement and Samadoun, who's just been declared a terrorist organization.
I know.
What are they, about a year or 2 years behind Germany and the Netherlands? But they are. They targeted her for the crime of saying we should have Holocaust education in schools. At that point, the two targets on her back, she was Jewish and recommended that. And the BC Premier, not a single NDP cabinet minister member of parliament stood up for her and said, no, this is out of bounds. She was promised by the Premier, David Eby, to protect her. As she says, it lasted 4 days. She was the sacrificial lamb. So we're seeing it. But the problem for the federal Liberals, they have people who are anti-Semitic in their caucus. They have people in the NDP federally. Look at what happened to QP Ontario with Fred Hahn.
Oh my God.
He's going to be the poster child.
I know.
Hamas is going to give him a special day. It was blatant. And we found out that we have academics, people in organized labor, obviously people in parliament and in legislatures that were clearly, anti-Semitic. Well, my gosh, if that isn't a different Canada than most of us thought we were operating with.
Yeah.
One more thing. Sorry. I want to emphasize this. So we've got people who we've elected who, in this regard, toward Jewish Canadians, Jewish citizens here, are closer to a Nazi ideology than they are to what we called, I think, consensus-wise Canadian values. Mm-hmm. That sounds harsh, but come on, show me the evidence where that's not true.
Yeah, closer is a term that applies there, I think. I'm too young to remember a lot of major foreign political religious standoffs. But the one thing I do remember is, I was 13 or 14 in 2001. And I remember the clear, instant and wide ranging, villainization, sometimes criminalization, I think even here, about anti-Muslim, anti-Islam rhetoric from the West. And we did days on this stuff in school. I remember I went to a Catholic school too. And, I remember it was overwhelming almost. And I think there's value to that. Don't get me wrong. Like we always say, and I know you think this as well, it's not about labeling everyone with the same, characteristics, but there are some bad apples that need to be reminded and in some cases reprimanded for behaviors that are detrimental to the sort of, fabric of society. And you're seeing that here. One thing I can't figure out, and I don't know if you have a thought on this, in 01, there was no doubt from broader society that we had to do this. And no matter how much it hurt to put on a pedestal for a little bit the idea that all, Islamic people were not these types of people, that all Muslims were not violent extremists.
Of course.
We recognized it, right, as a society. And here we're trying to do the same thing and say, look, we have another cause here that needs our support. And Mike, no one seems willing to do it even at the societal level. Why? The governments, I understand. I don't agree, but I get it. The people, why not the people? This is one thing I cannot wrap my head around.
I'm with you. I don't know where it fits in terms of their issues, the list of issues they have. Certainly haven't had much. We have exceptions to this one, but academic leadership. There have been some exceptions, but not the vast majority. I mean, they had these protests that were preventing Jewish professors, Jewish students from crossing the so-called encampment. Right. Where was the absolutely? I don't see where the nuance needs to be on this. Or we have to go, well, it's not black and white. Actually, it is. If you're one of them and you're prevented from going, it's very straightforward. Yeah. And I think this found us wanting, as a Canadian public, as you say, how many people say this is unacceptable? Or here's always a tough one. How many people would change their vote based on this? Saying, well, it's clear. Like, I'll go back to Selena Robinson saying very clearly, not a single member of her BC NDP caucus stood up for her. Not one. Not one, but stood up to what? Stood up to this terrorist group, Samadoun. Yeah. Stood up to the Palestinians, and there's several other groups that we've allowed. Keep in mind, sorry, me. Joey knows this, by the way, everybody. I just never stop.
This is great.
I'm going to behave myself here in 1 second. But think about this. So Samadoun is Hamas affiliated, sympathetic. Mm-hmm. They're not allowed to travel in Europe. The Netherlands has just outlawed them as a terrorist group. Germany had already done that. And we had them as an NGO in Canada. They got a special tax status until 2 weeks ago. Yeah. To be fair, but I'm going, this wasn't new information. I knew this without ever focusing on this. I knew who that group was. I knew who Hamas is, and I know who Hezbollah, that kind of thing. So yeah. I'm going, we had them as NGOs. Like, oh yeah, that's that. I want to give a tax break to those guys.
I just don't know how that happens. And it's frustrating. I try not to bring up the trucker thing that often here because one, it's just so divisive. And two, it's in the past. I try not to, go down this road, but I just think how swift and all encompassing the response was to the protests on Capitol property there down in Ottawa, I think in 21 or 22, whatever year that was. Time is flying, but I can't.
That's a legitimate point you're making.
Yeah,
there's clearly two sets of rules, and as I say, it would have been they opened themselves to this. So in government, there shouldn't be two sets of rules, one for the truckers and one for pro-Hamas protesters.
Yeah, terrorist groups, right? Legitimate terrorist groups abroad. Yeah.
So there has. So it's difficult not to see that.
It's frustrating as someone who's, I think about to, as a Bitcoin guy, enter into the crosshairs a little bit in terms of what I'm allowed to say and not say about the sort of sanctity of the Canadian dollar. We can maybe get into that.
Well, let me get, as I deal with this all the time.
Yeah.
And I always say, on Money Talks, obviously I say things that are controversial when we talk all of this stuff. I said, well, let's just see the track record. Let's just back off and see how it worked. Yeah. So the number one issue for individuals is the declining purchasing power of our currency, and well, is that deniable? I mean, obviously not. Now, people may call that inflation. The bottom line is that dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to. In a significant way. Like you got me $1 in 2000, the year 2000. You got my $1 now. I can only buy 54 cents worth of the same goods.
Yeah.
It's being measured by gold. It's being measured by, as you well know, and our audience knows, this is what's driven Bitcoin is lack of confidence in government and central bank management of the currency. So I just think it's the number one issue. And by the way, well ignored for about latest thing MNP survey came out. It's about 51% of Canadians saying they've had to make adjustments, and some are seriously in stress, absolutely consistent. Yeah. We have forgotten the half of Canadians who have found it difficult. I'm thinking, by the way, on the other side, every policy they make helps people who own stocks.
Yeah, I know.
You know what I mean? Like that isn't the lower half. That's what the top 10 are. I'm not knocking people doing well, but those policies directly relate to the top, 20% of Canadians?
Yeah.
What about the other 80? And what, at least my sense, I'm not going to tell people who own Bitcoin why they do it, but my sense is there's a huge concern about the quality of the currency and the credibility of the currency and many other government related issues that come up. But the bottom line is they needed protection. That's why they're pursuing it. And trust. They don't trust government either.
There's a collapse of sort of institutional trust all over the modern world. Canada is maybe at the sort of tip of that spear in a lot of ways, unfortunately for you and I. But it is funny, I listen to whether it's Macklem or Freeland or the big four economists now calling for a jumbo cut. Like I don't want to be in a situation where my policymakers are describing rate decisions the same way they describe Costco hot dogs. Like I prefer if we had a more balanced kind of like something that's not quite as front and center. But as you mentioned there, as the number of people who want to consume literature or commentary around rate cuts, the language around them will almost invariably, I don't want to say get dumbed down because that's not very nice, but it'll become simpler and easier to understand for a lot of people who are experiencing this for the first time. It's funny. You mentioned, people tightening their belts and having to adjust. Canadians are great at describing the symptom, but terrible at describing the problem.
We're understanding where it came from. Absolutely.
Exactly. And so I want to ask you, what should Canadians really be looking at as the cause? There's so many things now being bandied about. We've heard from not only from our leadership, but leadership all over the world that it's, Putin's price hike, Russian inflation, it's OPEC's fault. It's not OPEC's fault. Housing is too expensive because of speculators. Galen Weston is causing inflation. It's anything but basically, debt issuance, right? What is that? You know what I mean?
Like, no, you're absolutely right. Jagmeet Singh, NDP leader.
You know what I mean? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, you have to go back to inflation. And the bottom line was this, is there was a massive increase in money supply, monetary changes, fiscal changes. That's the government spending a ton of money at a time when there were supply shortages. Mm-hmm. Well, what's going to happen? You pump the system full of money. I think Canada's went up, money supply jumped 26% in 2 years with shortage of goods. Well, it's going to go up. The U.S. even worse than ours. So, as Milton Friedman famously said, everywhere and always, inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and people can follow that through. If somehow money disappeared from the system, you don't have it to bid the price of goods and services up. But we had a two-pronged attack. What was the Bank of Canada doing? Well, they knocked interest rates down to record lows. I've got some investment properties where, that I don't even bother looking at the interest. They're so low, and I've got them for another 2 years. As many, many millions of Canadians did. Gee, and what a surprise that housing prices went up. You had two ingredients: increased population beyond anything. They didn't plan any of that.
No.
And you had the Bank of Canada literally saying, March 2020, we're going to guarantee 5-year mortgages, basically. So no risk to the banks. So they'll lend to everybody and anybody. Well, presto, you got higher housing prices. That's been exacerbated, as I said, by uncontrolled. Now, I'm going to use the Prime Minister's own words because you see, people who have a political bent always say, well, you just don't like that politician. The Prime Minister said the temporary visas were out of control.
You got it.
Well, I believe him. You can't add 2.1 million people to the population in 2 years and go, I'm surprised they had to live somewhere.
Yeah.
You alluded to the colleges. I mean, the abuse of the temporary student visas in the colleges, especially in Ontario, was outrageous. They were basically selling permanent residency under the guise of getting a degree, and so we have this mass change in immigration in the nature of it. We used to have a point system in 2019. Mm-hmm. They changed it. So what we did is we've now imported a lot of people with low skills. That kept wages down for existing Canadian workers.
Yep.
But it also reduced our productivity because the low-skilled worker doesn't produce as much. So you always hear this measure, Canada's productivity per capita has been down. Well, that's the most important economic measure in terms of predicting standard of living. So that's been declining. Capital investment, that's been declining. I mean, these important key measures for the economy are all down. And let me anticipate the question. Why? Because it has not been a priority for the federal government. The NDP Liberal government, you can't make the case that economic growth was their priority. Their priority, and they're welcome to it. We have a democracy. We can vote for these things. The priority, obviously, for Liberal and NDP supporters is climate change, number one. LGBTQ2+ is number two, and other gender issues. But the economy is nowhere to be found. That's why, if you want a good laugh, from the economic point of view, you always listen to the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. He has no clue. Like absolutely no clue,
Do you ever notice when you watch QP, Jagmeet Singh is in the nosebleeds when they cut to him? You ever notice that?
Yes, I have actually. Well, but I'm just saying that his priority is not sound economics. I have no sense or evidence that he's ever read an economic report that didn't have a foregone conclusion, to support his. So economics is not a priority until it hits you. As you said, people don't like the result of a higher cost of living. Absolutely correct. They don't know where it comes from. And housing, oh my goodness, where does that come from? Check out the development fees.
I know.
Check out the other ways. All three levels, not just one, all three levels put their hand out. It's a cash cow. Gee, what a surprise. Prices went up.
Yeah, shocker. You should I listen to your show every week, and I always laugh when Ozzy tries to. He's another guy who's like he's trying to hang on to the cheery persona that he brings to the show, but it's harder and harder every week when he's like, yeah, housing again, like development fees through the roof.
I'm trying to do what politicians didn't, and that is I'm always surprised. Keep in mind, housing wasn't an issue at the federal level until they got a polling result in August of 2023, so a year ago in August.
Yep.
The prime minister about 2 weeks earlier had said housing's not a federal responsibility. They got a polling result said, guess what? You're going to lose the next election. It doesn't get there fast. And, so I'm not saying things that I've just been blown away at how lack of foresight, when you let in that many people, when we literally had this explosion in temporary visas. And let me add one more thing. So you issue a temporary visa. You got a temporary work visa. I've got a temporary student visa. They don't know if we leave.
That's right.
Now think about that. I've come from a difficult country with difficult living conditions. My student visa is over, or my work visa. Do you really think I'm going back voluntarily? So it's the challenge is even bigger. And there's a difference with the housing, though, that I thought marked a turning point. People understand you can't bring in that many people and not push your housing market. They understand you can't bring in that many people with a healthcare system that's already, having a difficult time being sustained. The pressure on our social infrastructure, which, by the way, the TD Bank brought out a report a year ago, August, warning about this. But there's other warnings. You have Prime Minister Trudeau standing up before he was Prime Minister with a formal speech printed in the Toronto Sun saying, hey, be careful with the way you're doing temporary visas.
That's right.
And of course, it's been much more explosive since then.
Some of the most, it's unprecedented. I want to ask you about I don't know if I've told you this before on your show or when you come on here, but there's like this sort of thesis in Bitcoin that the end point of all this is already basically laid out for you. You can see it. And the road may be winding in one direction if you vote this way, or winding in another if you vote another way, but you're going to wind up at the same finish line. And that finish line is inflation, currency debasement, lack of faith in institutions, probably balkanization of major nations, and probably more things than that I've not considered yet. It's the Martin Armstrong thesis, basically, right? And when I look and see, you mentioned that poll in 23 that jousted housing to the front of the line when it came to federal priorities, at least in public speeches and public addresses. Is that a good thing, Mike? Because when I look at what's happened since, we've put in programs where now first-time buyers can get $1.5 million insured or uninsured for new builds. And I know some first-time buyers or potential first-time buyers, and they're excited, but I keep telling them that the implication here is that every first-time home in Canada, for the entry-level home now, the implied value is $1.5 million Canadian dollars, and that's not a place you want to be. The average Canadian home now, entry level, I would guess, is probably somewhere between 6 and 750, maybe a little less in some places, but let's call that the mean.
Mhm.
$1.5 million is not a number you want to jump to that quickly on the back of a subsidy, number one. And number two, I'm really worried the handouts are just getting started as we head into an election. And I'm curious, do you have a thought on whether or not we should be really hoping that maybe they just don't notice the problem and we can try and slow this down? Because it seems that when they do notice the problem, the gas canister comes out and that thing is just raining all over the place.
Well, I think the challenge is this. It is a massive problem. You're so far behind. They talk about building 4 million homes by 2030. Well, that would double every year, and we're already behind now. Keep in mind, they made that promise over a year ago. So we're already behind. They don't want to look at the actual problem. They can't even diagnose the problem. We've got too many people coming in and not enough housing being built. So as you mentioned, they've made that change to have insured mortgages go to a higher number. The problem is that's a demand side. We don't need more demand. That's not the issue. Also, if you noticed, have you ever seen any politician stand up and say, we're too greedy when it comes to housing? We have got,
Don't think so.
In Ontario, I'm more familiar with Waterloo and London, Ontario, and Toronto in their development fees. And it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Out in Vancouver, it's 30% of the cost of a new build. Well, they should be talking about themselves, and they're not. Like, what does affordability mean? It's a lovely little phrase that every politician has been uttering for years now. This isn't brand new. It's just worse. Well, what does that mean? You mean the labor who builds a house is taking a discount? No. Do you think materials you're getting at a discount? Nope. Where's the discount? Because you haven't changed your fee structure, your tax structure around this. They're not solving this. It's unless you have a radical change in government and government approach. But then you bump into other things. Like, it's clear that the Liberal NDP federal government wanted bigger government. So under Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister, they've raised the size of the civil service 42%.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they got about 9,000 more executives. The payroll's at a record. That's not compatible with reducing your revenues. So I'm talking it's at that fundamental a level. We could go through the provinces, maybe the sister province of the federal Liberals actually is the NDP out in British Columbia, that also experienced some massive growth in debt, massive growth in the size of the civil servant. And then everyone wanders around and say, what do we get for that money? That's what Yves Giroux is, our parliamentary budget officer. And he's very careful. I've had the pleasure of chatting with him a few times. But he keeps saying, he doesn't want to say it, but he keeps saying, Canadians have to ask themselves, what did they get for that extra tax they're sending in, or the extra, expenditure at government? What did they get? Because it wasn't an improved healthcare system, which is number one issue for people. It wasn't improved traffic in a lot of ways, and I think that's why governments, by the way, generally are unpopular. It's, because they talk about stuff the public doesn't want until they throw it down their throat. And just one other point about that. We have a tendency to be myopic about what's going on in Canada and the States. And something I'm going to actually do this weekend is to remind people, Donald Trump didn't cause the anti-establishment movement. He is a byproduct of it. But as is Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, as is Marine Le Pen in France, as is Giorgia Meloni in Italy, as is Javier Milei. This is happening globally. It's a rejection of the establishment. And, people can add in why, it is because it's not ignoring their track record. That's for sure.
No, it's not. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so worried about sort of what seems to be an almost miraculous global alignment in terms of these just bad policy decisions. I think that it's naive to suggest that there's not some coordination, because the less competition there is between nation states for brain power, the less these guys have to worry about implementing poor policy. As you mentioned there, they just shovel it down your throat and that's all there is to it, right? You do what they say and that's it. It's funny. I kind of painted this picture for someone the other day. I have a lot of still left-leaning friends. And And I said, when you ask people why they vote for Trump and why they don't listen to the media and why they, will vote for Polyev and think the CBC should lose their funding, just imagine what the average life of that person is like. Okay.
Sure.
You go through COVID, you return to your laptop job, and that's sort of the best case, but it's still pretty bad when you lay it out like this. You send your kids back to school. The teacher is incompetent because they came through a program that was overcrowded, only cared about admitting as many people as they could for money, and taught them kind of social justice nonsense. So your kid's not getting as smart as they should. When you look for support from the school board, they tell you that your priorities are not their priorities and you have to live by their priorities. That's not good. That's if you have time to talk to them, because the job that you have, even though it's only 30 kilometers away, it takes you an hour and a half to get there and an hour and a half to get back. So by the time you get back home, you have to make some food for you and your family, or prepare some food for you and your family. And by the way, you're not eating steak. You're eating like dinosaur chicken nuggets because it's the only thing you can afford, because your salary didn't keep up for the 4 years during the pandemic. And now you're in this situation where literally every part of your life, like, excuse my French, just fucking sucks, and a lot of people are living this now, and they're asking the question that you're asking: what am I getting for all this? I'm losing 35-40% of my paycheck. And this is maybe a good lead into the healthcare thing. So I told you before the show, I'm going through this for a different reason. My wife is like 3 weeks away from our firstborn coming out. And, I've been through the healthcare system a few times myself. I've had like ACL surgery, meniscus surgery, Achilles tears, and like all manner of athletic injuries. And every time I always end up having to go through one bad doctor to get to a good doctor. And, you're advocating for yourself and doing all these things that the Canadian sort of way of life would have you believe is necessary, even though you're paying all this money. You've just gone through it and had it sounds like a decent experience. But a lot of people are not sharing the experience you and I have. A lot of people are coming here and having a terrible time being diagnosed, finding specialists. You point out all the time on your program the number of deaths on the wait list for treatment or observation or care of some nature in a country for which you have probably spent most of your working life, if not all your working life, contributing to, with the hope that you will be able to get the care you need. And I'm going to quote you, because I thought this was really good. I remember where I was when I heard this. I was walking my dog. No matter what, at some point, you're going to be at the mercy of the healthcare system. And you better hope that healthcare system has some mercy for you. And, I don't know what to say about all this, because I look at what's happening in terms of immigration. We'll kind of tie a knot on this with the immigration discussion. But the number of people coming in who are 50, 45, 40 years old, who have not paid for 20 years, are bringing in elderly parents, bringing in children, bringing in and expecting care without paying into it. I mean, there's a problem there. It's an unpopular thing to discuss, but it's an issue. And more and more Canadians now are calling for the dissolution of what were formerly golden goose programs, healthcare and the pension. Mm-hmm. In your view, what is the likelihood that either of these things are dissolved in their current form by the end of, let's say, a Polyev term as prime minister, or 15 years? I think it's way higher than most people realize, even though there's a lot of stink about that outcome.
Well, I would say to people, first of all, they have to recognize that's a problem. Access to a waiting list is not access to healthcare. We do know that thousands of people are dying waiting for diagnostic scans, waiting for treatment. Now, maybe they were going to die anyways. I don't know, but we know there's a good number of people. Well, that's not access to healthcare. When we rank last in the Commonwealth Fund Index for the time it takes to see a specialist after referral, and it's worse than ever, literally worse than ever, that's not healthcare. We have to admit that's not healthcare. There should be nothing sacred about that. And I want to be clear. I'm not talking about the men and women who work in that system. They are overwhelmed. I did have the unfortunate experience of waiting in emergency twice in the last couple of months. For first time was 8 hours, second time was over 10, and they can't do anything about it. You don't have enough doctors to service, waiting emergency rooms or nurses. So they're having a heck of a bad time. You put them down there, go ask somebody who's working in that side of things. Mm-hmm. It's horrible. Then they have closures of emergency wards. There's the closures in every province, including Ontario, Quebec, out in British Columbia. They've had emergency room closures. How is that possible that we think that we pretend that's healthcare? So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's a monster challenge that shouldn't be politicized. You find something politicized, and I'll tell you, you're not getting a solution. Now that's a pipe dream on my part. As for the Conservatives, if they do form government, it'll be interesting to see. Believe me, I'll have the same lens applied to them as I do to any other party.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you're doing working?
Yeah.
Is it following the research based? In the way of healthcare, though, come on, we rank last in so many categories. Germany ain't having the problem. Austria isn't having the problem. Why? Why are they a more superior system in terms of access and wait times? Primary care doctors, come on, we've got millions of Canadians who don't have access to a primary care doctor. Mm-hmm. So start with, this is not working. All gloves are off. Where is it working? What can we learn? And I'm still saying it's much more complex than that. But I mean, we're not even on that page yet. We're not even on the page of, I wonder if there's any lessons to learn elsewhere. Instead, we have a lesson learned from North Korea. No private care. Yeah. Well, actually, that's not true, because if I was a provincial cabinet minister, if I was a federal cabinet minister, if I was a federal prisoner, if I was military, I would get access to private care. And I'll give you one more example, just because people who aren't across the country may not know this. It is a laugh. There's no jurisdiction more than British Columbia who fought private care, including when the Cambie Street Surgery Center is a private clinic that was set up under the urging of the NDP in the early 90s. Okay, so we still have it in British Columbia, not in Quebec, but in British Columbia, you can't access private care on your own. I can't go and get private care to speed up the wait list. As I said, these other categories of occupations can, but the real farce is, after they fought Dr. Brian Day, former head of the Canadian Medical Association, a real hero of patient care, not the system. After they started to send cancer patients to private clinics in Bellingham.
It's insane.
It is. It's insane. Yeah. It's $16 million so far and counting. Why? Because you were killing them waiting for treatment. Well, that's the story. That's my story.
Yeah, it really is not that hard to see that. So I'll note two things and I'll get your thoughts. The first thing I would say is private care here in Ontario is completely invisible, if there is any. Mm-hmm. But I know of one through the time I've spent in various weight rooms over the years. There is one clinic here, not far from Toronto, that does hernia repair. Yeah. And this hernia clinic, Mike, is the it's the most popular place. Every guy over 50 who's had a hernia wants to talk about this place over a pint. As soon as you bring up that you think you have all these guys want to talk about. It is the most pleasant experience. It's not that expensive. The care is incredible. They keep you there for a day before, keep you there for a day after. You're playing cards, you're taking walks. It's incredible from start to finish. It's something that a hospital cannot match and maybe is not intended to match, which brings me to my next point. The administrative state here in Canada, it has become so burdensome and so detached from the problems and the realities on the ground that when I think about what happens in a high-level meeting at a major Hamilton hospital or major Toronto hospital, major Vancouver hospital, the waiting list is too long. What do? Well, here's what we do. We try and turn this into even more of a conveyor belt and call center sort of, model, and just get people the hell out of here as soon as they come in. Even if we're wrong, they're at least moving. And what people want to feel like is they're moving. People want to feel like they're better. They don't want to feel like they're moving, because now everyone is kind of in transit, as you mentioned, between specialists and family doctors and different agencies. And in the worst case, you're still not getting a diagnosis. You don't know what's wrong with you, and your condition is deteriorating. You're not contributing to the economy. It makes your family life more difficult. All these things, none of which, to bring it back to the beginning of the show, should be part of the Canadian way of life. And we've been sold this false bill of goods when it comes to these golden geese. I don't know what the fix is, but I know it's not the way we're doing things now. Now, we've been blackpilling here. I don't know if you know that term or not, but we've been blackpilling here for the last 45 minutes. Blackpilling is when you're talking about all things, all doom and gloom. We're gonna stop with the doom dealing for now, and let's wrap up with a couple of bright spots here.
just one sec. I've got to say one thing.
Go.
You talked about the hernia private
Yeah.
clinic.
Yeah.
Well, Jack Layton used that. After all the talk, check out Buzz Hargrove, former head of the CAW. When his knee, you said your knee was torn,
Yeah.
ACL.
Yeah.
Asked how many people got in and out within a week. We did. If we don't, this farce that we don't have a two-tiered system, it is absolutely a red herring. As I said, there's certain occupations, certain politicians that can do it, that have a two-tiered system.
Yeah.
If you think a professional athlete, if one of the Maple Leafs needs something, you don't think he's getting it quicker than the year wait list right nearly for orthopedic? So
Yeah.
I just, let alone all the other farce about that private care debate when your doctor's office is private, for goodness sakes. Chances are the x-ray people have a private clinic. There may be an MRI private, depending where you are in the country. It's been a farce, and that's really the challenge. We've allowed BS and nonsense to dominate this debate. And finally, it's catching up with Canadians in general, not just specifically, but in general.
I've enjoyed seeing it catch up. I mean, the thing I want to close with, on Money Talks, first of all, if people are not listening to Money Talks, they should be. I tell our guests this fairly frequently because I always say, like, man, I heard this on Money Talks last week. We got to talk about this. The show revolves around two things, okay? Aussie jerks, bad jokes, and ways to protect your wealth. And, you guys have done such a good job over the years. I've heard uranium, I've heard gold, I'm on there talking about Bitcoin. You got guys talking about real estate, guys talking about small caps, guys talking about foreign investment, domestic investment, energy, you name it, anything. What does Mike Campbell think? You're always asking the questions. Now I get to ask you, what do you think over the next 10, 15, 20 years? We're talking about a generational shift here in the way people think both about wealth and about protecting it. Because now you're not just protecting it from the markets, Mike. I think you're trying to protect it from the government too.
Yes.
So what do you think?
Number one, if you think the government's coming to the rescue, you don't have any evidence that's going to work for you. I mean, they caused the healthcare problem. They caused the housing problem. They caused the inflationary problem that's troubled for so many people. I mean, I think it's delusional to think government's going to all of a sudden transform itself and get accountable and get results. It hasn't. It's just, let's get real. Yeah. So that's one. Secondly, so what does that mean? We're in a monetary shift here right now, and you better be protecting yourself. And the number one issue is how we measure our wealth, which is money. Yep. Well, the money is being debased. When they came out with the capital gains change, and I thought, what a farce that there's a debate about that, but there's also debate about whether you gained any money. So if you bought a house, for example, in 1990 for $400,000, sold it today for $870, you didn't make a cent in terms of what you could buy with that, because it takes $850,000 to $870,000 today to buy what $400,000 bought in 1990. Well, and we could break down every year for that, by the way. It takes $1 today, what 54 cents bought in the year 2000. Well, that's a huge problem. So the number one issue is, how do you protect yourself? So that's why we were cheerleaders for gold, big time, never stopped. Mm-hmm. And that's because I'm not a trader. I'm personally not a trader. I want to be positioned in the right stuff. So as you know, I liked Bitcoin. I still don't trust government, by the way, on it. Yep. So yep. I'd like to have an exposure, I call that, even though it may end up doing, it's done very well. But government, I still don't trust. The whole reason that people buy Bitcoins, they don't trust government. I still don't trust government on Bitcoin. I like it, but I don't trust the government's impact with it. Just like we've seen with housing. Come on. Housing is a cash cow for government. That's my reservation about housing now, as an investment. Mm-hmm. But I mean, gold is money. Bitcoin is a substitute, a newer one for sure, obviously. I like commodities. I think in the end, I think oil could have another dip here, by the way. But in the end, we've learned this lesson, I hope. We need energy. And if you need energy, you need nuclear. So I'm always on, and we've made a lot of money on nuclear. we started a long time ago saying, but it wasn't some deep thought. It was, oh, you want clean energy? You don't want emissions? Oh, I've got something. It's called nuclear, and it's worked for about 30 years. That's a deep thought. It was just simply aligning with it and aligning. And I still, as I say, we're not off of fossil fuels I mean, there's no scenario that I've read that is convincing.
For sure.
I have read many scenarios where renewables are not adequate. There's so many problems with them. But a great example of investment is I don't look for things I agree with. I look for things what I think people are doing. So I knew we were going renewable, whether it didn't make sense or how much sense it made. Oh, that meant copper shortages, and so longer term, I still like copper. You need it for electrification. And plus we've got whatever percentage of the world, is it 80% don't have sufficient energy, with a
minimum.
huge percentage have no electricity at all.
Yep.
All of those themes I think are still in play, amongst government printing up a ton of money. And one final thing, because it's a warning, I think owning long-term government bonds is really dangerous. And one of the most peculiar things you're seeing right now in the market, and people should be aware of this, and we talked about it on Money Talks, which is the Bank of Canada, as you alluded to, will lower rates again this week. Whether it's a half, most people are saying a half. We've already lowered them 75 basis points, 0.75%.
Yeah.
Well, why is the long-term bond going up? Why aren't long-term rates going down with it? Well, and in the States, it's very clear. Since the Federal Reserve dropped their rates in September by 0.5 point, the 10-year bond is up. The yield is up 0.6%. Why is that? People are confused because in the end, and this is going to be a huge key component, I may need to borrow money, but you don't need to lend it to me. And that's why central banks jump in. They've done it. People may recall this. They did that in Great Britain. They had a pension crisis. I think it was October 2022. Well, they came up with 60 billion pounds in an hour. Nobody else wanted those bonds. Silicon Valley Bank. What happened? They needed to liquidate. Well, sorry, we don't want to buy any of those bonds. So again, the problems start. That I still think is a big problem, but that's why I'm convinced of the devaluation of the currency.
Do you know, I didn't plan on saying this, but since we're talking about bonds, I'm going to look this up quickly. Do you know what Tether is, Mike, the stable coin? You're familiar with any of this stuff?
Yep.
Okay, so Tether has an insane amount of U.S. Treasury holdings, and they refuse to buy anything longer than 90-day. They are closing in on $110 billion in short-term Treasury notes. And sometimes I think to myself that, you're going to start to see countries too, by the way, pick up these sort of these indicators that something is not right on the horizon. And the speculative attack you're going to see is going to intensify. And we've seen it in Bitcoin a few times already with guys like Saylor taking equity in his company and buying more Bitcoin and just running this hamster wheel that seems to be working so far. Tether doing it is a different story because you're going right to the source, taking the interest from those 90-day notes and buying, a digital currency that's there because they don't trust that you can do anything past, in their case, 90 days with any sort of, they don't have faith in them past 3 months, basically, right?
But let me give you two things on that.
Sure.
One is, if you had just said they were buying U.S. Treasury, I'd be going, oh, no. But they're doing it exactly, recognizing that there's a liquidity risk. I think they're right. People ask, is a U.S., the big sovereign bond problem. Is the U.S. going to go bankrupt, or is this? No, they're not. They've shown us what they're going to do. They've shown us the central bank will print the money. I mean, I gave you two examples. I can give you 52. Okay, so that's one thing. Here's the other thing that I don't think is being noticed. So how come the U.S. dollar is still up? How come we just had a report that there was record amounts of U.S. treasuries held? What they didn't get, it was short term.
Yep.
It used to be long-term treasuries. So not what you've seen is, I looked at the account of the Grand Caymans, for God's sakes, and small, fast money things like you're discussing. We'll buy 30 days or 90 days. That's why it looks like there's bigger treasury holdings. No, it's very precarious. It's very short term, coming out of these hot money places, replacing, let's go back 10 or 20 years, replacing, we buy them for 10 years or 20 years and we hold them. That's not the case anymore.
No,
it's the U.S. T-bills have been unloaded down to the short term. And sorry, I mentioned Yves Giroux, head of the Parliamentary Budget Office. This is going back in November of 2020, when interest rates were like under 2%. And I said to him, well, why aren't we selling long-term bonds? He said, because you need to have a buyer. And we did not have a buyer. So it wasn't that they didn't want to, they couldn't.
That's so bad. It is so precarious is the right word. You used it. It really is like, we are dancing on a knife's edge. That's a good place to wrap. That's why the episode's called "Is Canada on the Brink?" Mike, you've been great as always. Tell people, as if they don't know already, Mr. Most Syndicated Show, but tell them where they can find you, about Money Talks, all that good stuff. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, I'd quickly say, if you need a headache, things are going too well, just listen to me, as I've proven. But you know what? You should go to moneytalks.ca, moneytalks.ca. You can sign up. We have a newsletter called Five Minutes with Mike. That's free. And I just throw tidbits. What I do is I assess what should be known, or it's important to know, and what's not in the mainstream. Because keep in mind, people who are in the mainstream very rarely understand economics or finance, especially on a macro level. So you can fill in the blanks there. So go to Money Talks tweets. I tweet a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Just because I haven't seen it elsewhere. And then you can discuss. I don't want to change anybody's mind about anything. I don't care. I really don't, but you should have the information. It's the old line, give the people the facts and democracy is safe. We don't give them the facts. There's many times we don't. So go to Money Talks tweets, Michael Campbell's Money Talks on Facebook. We produce Money Talks once a week that you can find on mikesmoneytalks.ca. This coming weekend, you mention him, it's Martin Armstrong.
Is it really? Wow. Good timing. Election coming up. That'll be great. That'll be great.
Yeah.
So, you got to tell Martin though, make sure his phone's off. If I have to listen to one more Martin Armstrong interview where his phone's going off, he's got that, "Excuse me, boss."
Oh.
Is that a text message? Every time I
bing, bing. Yeah, well, I've been to his office down in Florida, and he's got like 9 screens because, of course, I'm not saying it's his claim to fame. The Washington Journal called him the highest paid financial advisor in the world. He still advises around the world. But what was so pioneering for him is he understood that currencies are the key and international flows were the key to understand. So we've come to understand that a lot more. Mm-hmm. As money, Europe gets nervous, they pour money into the US. That's why we have been bullish. I was looking back for some other reason today. We have literally been bullish on the US dollar since 2009 and the US stock market. And again, I'm not talking trading. Inevitably, it had to go up because cash was coming in from the rest of the world. We may not like the US, but do you think it's safer than Europe? I think so. Yeah. That's the key. Certainly safer than anything in South America, in Africa. So it's the beneficiary that way. So he was the pioneer in looking at the global currency capital flows. And so, yes, he's got like all these screens around him and they go bing, 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 bing. I interviewed him once where I called bingo during it because I was sure I had won by then.
I look forward to it. If you guys are not tuned into Money Talks, you're missing out. That's been Mike Campbell. Thanks everyone for listening, watching. We will see you on the next one.